Okay, well, this brings us back to chips. So in that hypersonic missile, apparently there was very sophisticated U.S. microchip technology. Yep. It was the computer system running it had these tiny chips designed by Phytium Technologies, a Chinese firm. So Chris, can you tell us about Phytium?
Well, there's a number of Chinese firms like Phytium that have benefited from the ability to, first off, buy intellectual property or borrow it from U.S. firms, and then previously produce those chips in Taiwan. In the past couple of years, the U.S. has been cutting off Chinese firms' access to production capabilities in Taiwan, since the Taiwanese produce the most advanced chips in the world. And that makes the Chinese very frustrated, since they don't have the manufacturing at home. But right now, there's nothing they can do about it. The Taiwanese are several generations ahead of what the Chinese can produce, and they've been several generations ahead for the past decade. And so right now, when you look at military systems, chips are one of China's biggest vulnerabilities, because when they look to the next generation of systems that they want to develop, to design, to train, in the past, they've been relying on U.S. designed, Taiwanese produced chips. Now they don't have access to these types of chips in the data centers that they enable, and so it's a major problem for Chinese weapons designers.
So Chinese are at 7 nanometers, which is about where Intel is, right? So
that overstates. Chinese are at 7 nanometers for prototyping, but actually for mass production, they're closer to 14 nanometers. TSMC is going to bring online next year its 3 nanometer chip. So that's 4 generations ahead, and because of Moore's law, you get a doubling of computing power, roughly speaking, each generation. So if you're 4 generations ahead, you're far, far ahead in terms of the computing power.
Right. So Seth and Mike, this gets back to sort of using deterrence, and how does the chip sort of policies that the U.S. adopts create a deterrence?
Well, I mean, this one of the interesting ideas that's floated out there for deterrence is just making it very clear to the Chinese that if you invade Taiwan, we're going to blow up TSMC. I just throw that out not because that's necessarily the best strategy, but because it's an example of debate that's out there. And of course, the Taiwanese really don't like this idea, right? So as we think through what this strategy needs to be, we've got to think again about the sort of second and third order implications here of where this leads us. Are we fostering a very successful domestic Chinese chip industry that's eventually going to catch up to where we are, or are we adequately controlling, and sort of keeping them, keeping that lead that Chris just described in place? These are some of the questions that I think we're struggling to answer as we figure out what this economic.
Can I have a little inter-party dispute here on the blowing up TSMC? If you do that, you have a $2 trillion economic impact on the global economy within the first year, and you'd put manufacturing around the world at a standstill. I mean, this is a terrible idea.
I'm not promoting the idea. I'm not promoting the idea, Michelle.
You're just saying making the threat.
What I'm saying is these are some of the things that are actually actively being debated amongst U.S. Policymakers. And by the way, if China takes over TSMC, whether it's a Hong Kong style takeover or they take over by actually invading and actually able to capture this thing intact, we could very well face the same level of economic consequences, not globally, but for the United States.
But they are where they are because we offshored it for years, and we gave them the technology. They steal it. Export controls is what I'm very focused on, and I have jurisdiction over that. And I've been working with, it's actually an office within Department of Commerce. And for too long, we've been exporting things to Huawei, to SMIC. To your point on the hypersonic, that was built on the backbone of American technology. The spy balloon, when we looked at the component parts in the spy balloon, there were American parts in that balloon. So why in the world are we selling this to China? We're going to stop this. And I really think this administration, Secretary Raimondo, I've had good talks with her. We have to stop exporting and selling them the very technology they can put in their most advanced weapon systems that then they could turn against us. That's a policy that I think most, Republican and Democrat Americans can agree with. Really makes a lot of sense.
Kevin, you were going to say something?
Again, if you look at the whole matrix of measures to be taken on chips and technology writ large, it's a complex Rubik's Cube. If you go to the blunt instrument of saying complete ban, then it's has the consequences which Michelle outlined before. But if you seek instead, rather than, for example, in chips, to de-risk as opposed to decouple the relationship, which I think is the best way to frame the broader economic and technological relationship as well, to de-risk what the United States is currently selling on explicit national security grounds, item by item, category by category, this is a more effective and granular approach. In fact, it also has a further advantage. It places the United States in the mainstream of what is now the officially embraced policy of the European Union. And when it comes to long-term technology and financial deterrence of China, it's not just what the US of A does, it's what your friends, partners, and allies do as well. They will support the United States based on the approach most recently argued by Secretary of the Treasury Janet Yellen about de-risking. They'll find it much harder on the broad decoupling front, as will a whole large slab of American industry. And the final thing is, does China actually find itself in a position where it catches up? I think Seth raises this question. Are we fueling a domestic industry? My response to that is, in 2015, Xi Jinping launched the mother of all national industrial policies called China 2030, Made in China 2030.
Made in China 2030.
And if you look at the categories of tech listed there, starting with AI and moving through the rest, it's all there in black and white. What has simply happened in the intervening period of time over the last 5 to 7 years is that tens and now hundreds of billions of dollars have been added to each element of that industrial policy. China was heading that way anyway, so we should just assume that is a known factor. The variable here is what the United States and its allies is now doing. So on balance, none of this is perfect, but in the Rubik's Cube of getting it right, it's trending in the right direction.
Can I just add one thing? And since this is the Milken Conference and so many of you are, in CEOs and leaders in business, I just think that we really need a higher level and more candid level of dialogue between government and industry, because there's so much uncertainty. There's continuing evolution in these export controls, in investment controls, in various regulations, and how we're going to manage this competition. And it needs to be informed by voices from industry. Some of you will be in sectors that probably aren't even touched by this, but many of you will be touched by this in ways that you never imagined because of the extent, the multidimensional nature of the competition, and the extent to which technologies we think of as commercial will be leveraged by the Chinese military, and therefore we have to worry about them.
Dual use technology. So, I don't want to bore you, but in 1997, I prosecuted this guy, Johnny Chang, right? And there was a campaign finance investigation. Led us to the director of Chinese intelligence, China Aerospace, putting money in his Hong Kong bank account to influence a presidential election. Why? They wanted aerospace technology and satellites. They wanted to get into the WTO. And this stuff, really, it happened. And how did Congress respond after that? Well, we put satellite under what's called ITAR, under the State Department, and aerospace technology. So this is really nothing new. And they've been doing this for quite some time. And I would even argue their Belt and Road is so cleverly designed where they can get World Bank loans to fund their Belt and Road, usurious interest rate loans to developing nations, get them in a debt trap, take over a port, and then the IMF bails them out. They're very good at manipulating global institutions.
But can we really segment globalization? So it seems as though what's happening is that, we've got record trade between China and Taiwan, China and the US, and we want regular trade, so to speak, to go on, but we just don't want this segment of semiconductor trade to go on, except we'll have the allied sort of bloc that trades semiconductors, and then China and Russia and, the non-sort of allied and non-sort of democratic countries will trade among themselves. Can we really sustain that? Right now, American companies might, it's in the news, it's on their minds, people are worried. but, 1, 2, 3 years later, American companies, they need sales, they need to, sell things to China. There's going to be leakage. Can we really maintain that?
This is why, decoupling is neither possible nor wise. We are so integrated. So instead of taking a sledgehammer to the economic relationship, we need a surgeon's scalpel. It really is disentangling only in critical areas where there is this technological or national security implication, because we could overplay this in a way that shoots us in the foot, right? If you look at Silicon Valley, there's a lot of Chinese capital in Silicon Valley. We have to worry about that capital if it gets them access to non-public IP, or it gets them a board seat, or it gets them a controlling interest. But if it's just blood in the bloodstream, and they're a shareholder like anybody else, and it's money for our innovators, but it doesn't advantage the Chinese, I personally think that's fine. And cutting that off would be an example of shooting ourselves in the foot. So we have to be really thoughtful and really careful about where and how we disentangle. The one thing I will say that will be a break on Chinese retaliation is that, coming out of the pandemic and this terrible mistake of, the sort of COVID shutdown policy that Xi pursued, his main message to the world right now is we are open for business. He has to convince people that China is a good place to invest, a good place to come. And so when you target a Micron or another company or another company, and you kind of make
Like Apple, right?
the poster child of retaliation, that's going to really hurt your message of being open for business. And so he's walking a line on this too, that I think in most cases will cause them to do symbolic things to retaliate, but not actually, things that are terribly harmful to us.
Right.
At least for now.
Okay, great. So let's talk about U.S. foreign policy, and